We shall start our classes now, as we have already waited almost 15 minutes. You have classes. So today, the first class of PLM 6215, that is the course title of Governance and Public Policy in India. Here in this paper, we will talk about the conceptualization of the term governance and how they are related to public policy and how the recurring process of governance and public policy is reconstituted. So I will just give a brief introduction to what is expected in this paper, and then we will try to go through of the block one regarding today. In the paper, you will be able to understand regarding the defining governance systems, and then the historical Indian perspectives, and then the 8 attributes of good governance, and then the role of the states and the principle of law, and then state and conflict resolution, the civil society and individuals, and then the RTI Act, the institutional mechanism. And then we will try to and then I will show you a short case studies what you can understand from the 8 principles of good governance, which is discussed at the end of the classes. So let us start with what this governance and public policy actually try to signify. The first thing what you have to understand is that the course objectives is to make you able to understand and examine the the understanding of governance and how this illustration of governance is institutionalized in public policy and it is fundamental at practice. So with these outcomes, you'll able to internalize what are the various kinds of the governance is applicable and what in practice applicable can you observe and you can sensitize and which can be able to be outcome of a good citizen. In block one, we will start with the defining governance. So if we look across in terms of the defining governance, if we look at the etymology of it, it originates from the Greek kuberno, meaning to steer. Where the other perspective, if we see the use of political authority and the institutional resources to manage society's affairs. Governance focuses on the process of decision making and the formal and informal structure involved in implementation. The formal and informal systems. The formal governance based on written laws, constitution, and official institutions like the judiciary, administrative regulation, highly visible and documented. Informal governance based on unwritten norms, customs, and kitchen cabinets. These rely on social cultures, convention, and implicit agreement. The formal governance is where is legitimate legal process where there are certain structurized, standardized, contemporary forms of systems where there are the permissible forms of law. The formal governance in terms of the parliament, in terms of the assemblies, in terms of the judicial courts. These are the constitutional law which is visible and documented. The informal governance, sometimes which is also termed as the informal way, the unwritten norms where the punishable is not mandatory. Where in terms of formal governance, certain penalties or punishable offense can be related to it. Informal are the unwritten forms, mainly the formal is the written, the legalized, the standardized, the institutionalized form, which is uniform, most of the uniformly practice in our day-to-day life. Informal governance are those which are unwritten norms, customs. If we look at the historical perspectives of Indian perspectives, we see that there are Arthashastra where it talks about the informal governance. Kautilya prioritized the happiness of subjects over the king's own desire. Dharma as the root of administration. Focusing on the Gandhi's focus Sarvodaya, upliftment of all, and decentralization, empowerment of local self-governance, panchayats. And if we look the modern India, which is constituted through the preamble of India and the overthrow our constitution, focuses on the parliamentary democracy, rule of law, and social performance like programs like Rega. So this is how the formal institutionalization in terms of governance, these things, whether it talks about Arthasastra or the Sarvodaya, which can be put towards the informal aspect. But in terms of the formal governance, we see the parliamentary forms of democracy, of law. And if we see the 8 attributes of good governance, the 8 attributes governance firstly is participation, where the inclusive involvement in decision making, transparency, the openness and clarity in information law, the rule of law that is impartial information system of law, and the responsiveness, the prompt service to all stakeholders, the consensus, the mediations of interest for community benefits, the equity, inclusive growth for the most disadvantaged, effectiveness, optimal resource utilization for results, the accountability, responsibility of institution to the public, the participation, transparency, the rule of law, responsiveness, the consensus, the equity, the effectiveness, and accountability. The role of the states. So the role of the state is defined by 4 elements: the population, territory, government, and sovereignty. The population, the state is defined by 4 elements: the population, the people, the jurisdiction of which under territory, the government. Unlike society which will moral authority, the state possesses collective power to enforce social order and resolve conflicts. The people organize for law within a definite territory. That is what Woodrow Wilson talks about. The principle of rule of law, if we see the dicey course pillars, the absence of arbitrary power, equality before the law, the primacy of individual rights, like Joseph Roth adds the stability of law, the independent judiciary and natural justice. When we talk about in terms of the state and conflict resolution, the state serves as the ultimate mediator in resolving societal conflicts through judiciary, through executive, through legislature. If we look across through judiciary, it is protecting fundamental rights, Article 32. If we focus on the executive implementing presidential rule, Article 356, enacting progressive law to reduce group frictions. So civil societies and individuals also plays a significant roles in terms of the governance and public policy, whether in terms of advocacy, the CSO participate in policy discussion for poverty reduction. In terms of the protection, they providing legal aid to those lacking judicial accesses. The mobilization, engaging communities in local development. The transparency, pushing for RTI and pushing for and local youths act. So these are the civil society in which individuals are related in terms of the advocacy, in terms of what protectionist record, what the mobilization of communities record, and transparency, pushing for certain right to information act and local or local youth acts. The RTI Act, the Right to Information Act, which also becomes as a part of a good governance, the institutional mechanism, which give the people the choice to inform in terms of the right to inform information. The purpose is to enhance transparency and curb corruption in public authorities. The timeline which is given is the mandatory response within 30 days of application. They oversee the central CSA and state information commissions. The exemptions include information affecting national security or individual privacy, information affecting national security or individual privacy. So these are the forms which the RTI Acts are involved. The purpose is to create, as part of good governance and a both transparency of public policy, and then it requires a timeline of 30 days within the application. So oversights the Central CISC and State Information Commission. So these are the exemptions, the information regarding affecting national security and individual policy. So what we understand till now is that in this time in the governance and public policy, you're able to what we have understand the good governance is that the political authority institutional resources to manage society references. Governance focus on the process of decision making and the process of decision making and the formal and informal structure involving in implementation. The good governments include in terms of where we have seen that there are also examples of the formal and informal governance like Arthashastra, Gandhis in modern India of the parliamentary forms of information. The attributes of good governance also can be seen where in terms of the participation, transparency, rule of law, responsiveness, consensus, equity, effectiveness, and accountability. So we have also seen how the role of the state, how exemplified by Woodrow Wilson, that the people organize for the law within a definite territory. The state is defined by four elements: population, territory, government, and sovereignty, unlike society with moral authority. And the rule of law, the principles is also include arbitrary power absence, the equality, the individual rights, and where Joseph Brooks talks about in terms of the stability of law, and where the state and conflict resolution could happen with as a good governance of decision making, which judiciary have plays an important role protecting fundamental rights, Article 32, and the personal rules, that is Article 356, in crisis in the legislation enacting progress law to reduce the group friction. So civil societies and individuals. Advocating the civil societies, CSO participate in policy discussion for poverty reductions. In terms of the protection, providing legal aid to those lacking judicial access, mobilization, engaging communities in local development, and transparency, pushing for RTI, local and local youth act. These are the things which need to be formidable in terms of understanding in a better way. So RTI Act remain a very fundamental part, the Right to Information Act, where as part of the transparency of the good governance of the decision making, the RTI Act can be issued through within 30 days of application. And the Central and State Information Commission have to oversight all this process. The exemption includes certain which does not affect the national security and which in terms of the individual privacy. So in order to understand this far better, I will try to show you a small case study where you can understand good
There are 8 characteristics: rule of law, transparency, responsiveness, consensus-oriented, equity and inclusiveness, effectiveness and efficiency, as well as accountability. In this video, we will list and briefly discuss the 8 characteristics of good governance in relation to public administration. Welcome back to Public Administration 101 by Kano Consultants. For professional advice you can trust. As indicated, in this video, we will list and briefly discuss the 8 principles of good governance. Now, let's get into today's video. As a starting point, let us explain what good governance is. Governance is a concept that has been around for a number of years and is commonly used by many people. This concept generally means the process of decision-making and the process by which decisions are implemented or not implemented. In 1992, the World Bank released a report entitled Governance and Development, which set out its definition of good governance. The World Bank defined good governance as the manner in which power is exercised in the management of a country's economic and social resources for development. Another definition was provided, which refers to the of political and administrative authority at all levels to manage a country's affairs. Governance is also said to comprise of mechanisms, processes, and institutions through which citizens and groups articulate their interests, exercise their legal rights, meet their obligations, and mediate their differences. Meanwhile, according to the International Monetary Fund, which is the IMF, governance is described as a broad concept covering all aspects of how a country is governed, including its economic policies, regulatory framework, and adherence to rule of law. Specific reference has also been made to democratic governance, which is essentially a process of creating and sustaining an environment for inclusive and responsive political processes and settlements. It is therefore clear that there is almost no consensus on the official definition of governance, because its use often depends on the intended purpose, the people involved, and the socio-political environment of the term. In general terms, governance is considered the decision-making process, and the process of determining which policies will be implemented and not implemented. According to the United Nations, the concept of good governance has 8 major characteristics, which are as follows: participation, rule of law, transparency, responsiveness, consensus-oriented, equity and inclusiveness, effectiveness and efficiency, as well as accountability. We will now discuss each of these characteristics in more detail, and how each of these characteristics relates to public administration and the affairs of government. But before we do that, please remember to support the channel. For more content, make sure you turn on the notification button so that you don't miss out when we post new videos. And also remember to like this video. Now, back to today's video, where we will discuss the 8 characteristics of good governance in more detail, and how each of these characteristics relates to public administration and the affairs of government. Let's start with the first characteristic of good governance, which is participation. Participation by everyone in the affairs of government is one of the most important cornerstones of good governance. This participation could be either direct or through legitimate intermediary institutions or agents. Participation must therefore be informed and organized. On the one hand, participation means freedom of association and expression, and on the other hand, an organized civil society. The next characteristic is that public administration must be based on the rule of law. Good governance requires a fair legal framework that is enforced impartially. It also requires full protection of human rights, particularly the rights of minorities. Good governance in public administration must further be based on the impartial enforcement of laws by an independent judiciary, as well as an impartial and incorruptible police force. The next characteristic of good governance is transparency. Transparency means that decisions made and their implementation are made in accordance with the current rules and regulations. It also means that information is freely available and directly accessible to those affected by such decisions and their enforcement. It also means that enough information is provided. and that it is provided in formats and platforms that are easy to understand and easily accessible. The next characteristic of good governance is responsiveness. In this regard, good governance requires that government institutions as well as processes in place must attempt to respond to all stakeholders within a reasonable time frame. Good governance in public administration must also be consensus-oriented. This means that since there are multiple interest groups and as many viewpoints in a given society, good governance therefore requires mediating diverse interests in society in order to achieve a broad societal consensus on what is in the best interest of the whole community and how this can be achieved. It also requires a broad and long-term perspective on what is required for sustainable human development and how the goals of such development can be achieved. This can only result from an understanding of the historical, cultural, and social contexts of a particular society or community. The next characteristic is that good governance ensures equity and inclusiveness within the community. A society's well-being depends on ensuring that all its members feel that they have a stake in it and do not feel excluded from the mainstream of society. This requires all groups have opportunities to improve or at least maintain their well-being. Basically, public administration must develop policies that ensure that everyone has the same opportunity to maintain and to improve their welfare. Good governance further ensures the effective and efficient use of public resources. Essentially, good governance means that processes and institutions produce results that meet the needs of society while making the best use of resources at their disposal. The concept of efficiency in the context of good governance also covers the sustainable use of natural resources and the protection of the environment. Sustainability in this context refers to both ensuring social investments carry through and natural resources are maintained for future generations. The last but certainly not least characteristic of good governance we will discuss is accountability. Accountability is a crucial characteristic of good governance. Public administrators must be accountable to the general public and established constitutional institutions. In terms of who is accountable to whom, will depend on the decision or action taken, and whether such decision or action was taken internally, within a public institution, or externally. In general, public sector organizations and institutions, as well as public administrators, are accountable mainly to those who are affected by its decisions or actions. It is important to note that accountability cannot be enforced without transparency and the rule of law. In conclusion, the 8 characteristics of good governance assist public administration in ensuring that 1. Corruption is minimized. 2. The views of minorities are taken into account. And 3. The voices of the most vulnerable in society are heard in the decision-making processes of government. Good governance further assists the public administration by being responsive to the present and future needs of society. Although good governance is an ideal that is difficult to achieve in its entirety, however, steps must still be taken to make this ideal a reality. This will ensure the sustainability of human development. Before we end this video on the 8 characteristics of good governance and how they relate to public administration, we'd like to remind you to please check out these other videos on public administration and the administration of government affairs. Also make sure that you subscribe to our channel. And remember to like this video and also to leave us a comment below this video. You can also continue the conversation by following us on social media at consult.
I was trying to
and
Yeah.
secular
If we
society and
look
inclusive.
across how the principles of good governance and in these semesters is very fundamental for you to understand today. Because if we look across how governance is attributed to it, and without a good governance, it creates a chaos, it creates a war, it creates a crime. So these to understand the good governance, you need to able to follow and practice what governance and public policy meant. So what I'm trying to explain to you through these processes is that how the governance, state, and civil society and the people are all a recurring process of interrelations, and how good governance is able to process through the decision making structure, where governance focuses on the process of decision making, and it can be includes formal and informal structure involves. The formal governance can be in the form of legal process. Informal governance can be of the unwritten norms. Written norms, the formal governance, the unwritten norms, which is the informal governance. If we see through the historical side of it, like Arthashastra talks about how the subjects, the people are more important than the king's own self-desire. Dharma is the kind of a root which it need to emphasize. And Gandhi talks about how the local governance and decentralizations. And then in the post 1947 in India, we talks about how the democratic rules and social welfare is important attribute of a good governance. And good governance requires the inclusive participation, the transparency, the rule of law, the responsiveness, the prompt responsiveness, the people's acceptance, consensus, and the equity, the inclusive equity, the effectiveness, and the accountability, the responsibility. So the role of the states can be provided in terms of how sovereignty and power are collected, whether in terms of the population, territory, government, and sovereignty. So, in the principles of the rule of law, the absence of arbitrary power, the equality before the law, the primacy of individual rights obtains, that these need to be emphasized. What the principles of rule of law can establish, whether in terms of the state and conflict resolution, whether in terms of the judiciary. Judiciary is very fundamental in terms of the fundamental rights, Article 32, and executive and executives and executives is very important in the state and public role. So implementing president rules like Article 356 and legislature as well. So the civil societies and individuals plays a very important role in policy decision, whether in terms of the advocacy, in terms of the protection, in terms of the mobilization, in terms of the transparency. And then I told you that how the RTI Act, the institutional mechanism, is very fundamental in order to understand the RTI Act. The purpose is to enhance transparency, to curb corruption in public authorities. And the timeline is the mandatory response within 30 days of application. Besides the oversight, the central CIC, the state CIC information commissions, the exemptions, the information effectiveness of security or individual privacy. These are very important in terms of fundamental process that which need to institutionalize as a process, which need to be the purpose, which need to be a timeline of within 30 days. Then the central and the state information commissions have to oversight of it. The exemption includes the national security. So and I told you to go through what does good governance actually means, where you have understood that
There are 8 characteristics of good governance that are necessary for the proper management of public administration, and they
this was on the rule of law, where you saw that in the video as part of the case study. The good governance, uh, what the good governance require is in terms of how
effectiveness and efficiency, well as accountability. In this video,
The participation requires the rule of law, transparency, accountability, responsiveness, the inclusivity, the equity, the consensus oriented. These are the main mechanisms which you have to go through to it. If you have any, many of you are already have exited. So if you are still hearing me, you can the questions, the query which you have, which learn or which you want to ask, you can go through the PowerPoint, which we are going to send it to you after the classes is over, and then you come up with the question, the query, and also kindly go through the study learning material which will be provided to you, and then we will meet in the next classes. So if you have any further question, you can ask me. But what today the mainly thing which I was trying to tell you imply was that the syllabus of good governance, the syllabus of these papers 6213 sorry PLM 6215 is about the good governance and public policy in India. The whole governance, you need to have accountability, you need to have a structure, and in this good governance there is formal structure which are legal written rules, which are informal, which are unwritten rules. So with that, how transparency like RTI Act, and there are certain informal, like we have seen in Arthashastra, we have seen in Gandhi, how this has transformed into more such democratic mood of law, where it have come to a such kind of the formal governance. And then where RTI Act is also part of an important form where which good governance is required. So today was briefing you about the syllabuses, the course introduction, which you have to go through, which I will try to implore to you what is going what we are going to discuss in the classes. So any further queries, you can call in the official numbers of which is given to you in the schedule. So thank you so much for today.